I never thought that my home could turn into a field of struggle, where I was to struggle, not against some thieves or natural disasters but against those who called themselves protectors of our community. But it is just when, according to all signs, already everything finally turned out wonderfully that life prepares the most unpleasant surprises. June 2022. A hot California afternoon. I stood my ground, yes, finally mine, a plot of land in the posh Oak Grove area, a suburb of San Diego, 5 years working as a programmer in a large technology company, hundreds of nights overworked, dozens of missed vacations, all this finally bore fruit. 0.25 of an acre of land with breathtaking views of the Pacific Ocean became mine with one signature on the papers. Mr. Anderson, said Mr. Thompson, an elderly seller of the lot, was handing me the keys to the temporary fence. You are sure that you understand everything? His wife, Mrs. Thompson, stood aside, nervously sorting through the beads on her necklace. Of course, I replied with the smile of an experienced technician. I read all the documents. Property maintenance rules, construction restrictions, monthly installments, everything is like in any other prestigious area. The Thompson couple exchanged strange glances but did not say anything more. They rushed to their kids in Florida and I was their last trouble in California. The first couple of weeks were just a fairy tale. Every morning I woke up at 6 o'clock, took coffee from the local Morning Glory coffee shop, and spent an hour on my lot, watching the sun rise over the ocean. Together with a young architect, Mike, we developed the project of my future house, a modern one-story building with large floor-to-ceiling windows and an innovative solar panel system. It is going to be a masterpiece of modern architecture, Mike said, beaming with enthusiasm, and turning the three-dimensional model in his tablet. A completely autonomous house with the state-of-the-art, ecologically friendly technology. Look at those lines, the playing with the light. And all that with a view to the ocean. But even then, I should have noticed the first alarming signs. When Mike and I discussed the project on the site, I often caught the eyes of my neighbors. Not the friendly looks of new acquaintances, but something else, a mixture of regret and anxiety. Now I understand that they already knew things I didn't even know. The first bell sounded as I came to the HOA office to file a project for approval. The secretary, a young woman with sad eyes, kept hesitating to make an appointment with the head of the association. Mr. Sterling is very principled when it comes to new projects, she said, avoiding my eyes. Perhaps you could talk to one of the members of the architectural committee informally first? But I was too caught up in my plans to notice these small signals. 2 days later, I sat in the office of Richard Sterling, a man of 55 years with impeccably styled gray hair and a Rolex watch on his wrist. His office was decorated in dark colors, with heavy wooden furniture and hunting paintings on the walls. His pair of expensive gold-rimmed glasses made Sterling consider our project for a long time. His face didn't show any expression, but the air was full of tension. Finally, he laid down the papers and looked at me with that look which I would later see in my nightmares. Mr. Anderson, he began with an unpleasing smile. I am afraid this project categorically does not meet the aesthetic standards of our community. These solar panels, modern design. It's all too much. Progressive for Oak Grove. I tried to protest, showed the state's renewable energy laws, technical specifications, but every argument I came up with was shattered by his icy smile. Rules are rules, Mr. Anderson. Either you play after them or you look for another place to live. That evening, as I was heading back home, I saw Sterling standing at my lot. He was with some man in a $3,000 suit, and they were gesticulating excitedly, pointing this and that in the direction of the territory. I do not know what it was, but their behavior made something feel queer in my stomach. "Hello, neighbor," I heard a woman's voice. It was Sarah Johnson, my neighbor on the right, an attractive woman in her 40s with 2 teenage children. She stood near her mailbox, nervously clutching some envelopes in her hands. "I see you've already met our king," she said in a quiet voice as I approached. "Listen to good advice. Be very careful with them." Within this year, 3 owners lost their plots for alleged violations of HOA rules. And you know what? All these plots now belong to the company Sterling Development. A strange coincidence, isn't it? Those were the words that really should have severely warned me. But I, being the typical techie, was logic and law on my side guy. I knew all this was some sort of misunderstanding that I would somehow be able to share with the HOA and reach some sort of common understanding. Oh, how naive I was! What started as an innocuous rejection of the design of the house would soon turn into a real war. A war in which I risked losing everything but, instead, got the chance to expose one of the biggest scams in the history of Oak Grove. I had always thought of myself as a rational person. 15 years of working with code have taught me that any problem can be solved if you analyze the situation correctly. But what began to happen after my first meeting with Sterling defied any logic. The first punch was to have come the next morning. At 7:30 that morning, as I was on the lot having my usual coffee, an HOA inspector, a wren of a man with notebook and camera. "Mr. Anderson, we have a complaint about the unsatisfactory condition of your site," he said, taking pictures of every centimeter of the territory. The grass exceeds the permitted height by as much as 0.5 of an inch, and the temporary fence does not conform to the color palette approved by the association. I could hardly keep myself from bursting out laughing. But I only got this plot yesterday. And the fence was installed by the previous owners. The inspector just shrugged. Rules are rules. You have 24 hours to eliminate violations, otherwise you will be fined $500. That same day, I paid $600 for professional gardeners and a new fence. But that was only the beginning. The following week, the inspections became daily. Then the trash can was 2 inches closer to the street than allowed. Then the mailbox was not presentable enough. "They're trying to break you," said Sarah, inviting me out for dinner. Her kids, teenage twins, were picking in silence at their plates. First petty nitpicking, then fines, and then serious accusations. That was the case with the Johnsons last year. "What happened to the Johnsons?" I asked, and a chill ran down my back. Sarah looked down. They lost their house. It started with small fines and ended with an accusation of violating 10 different clauses of the charter. Fines grew like a snowball up to $100,000. The next day, I tried to find something about the Johnsons online. The search results were off: no court cases, no public records. It's like history disappeared. But when I dug a little deeper, using my skills as a programmer, I found something interesting. Their property was now owned by Sterling Development LLC. Continuing my investigation, I came to a similar pattern that other sites were following. Over the past 3 years, there have been 12 owners who lost their properties due to conflicts with the HOA. And all these plots were now owned by companies somehow connected with Sterling. "You're digging where you shouldn't, Mr. Anderson," I heard a familiar cold voice behind me as I left the coffee shop. Sterling stood leaning on his black Mercedes. "You know, your site has a great location. It would be a shame if you had to lose her due to non-compliance with the rules." His words sounded like a threat, but there was something else in his eyes: greed. I remembered the drawings I had seen on his desk last time, a plan of an apartment complex that would fit perfectly into several neighboring plots, including mine. "Maybe we should discuss this in more constructive atmosphere?" he continued. "Let's say tomorrow at 10 o'clock in my office? I am sure we will be able to find a solution which will satisfy both parties." I nodded, a plan forming in my head. Programmers love documentation, and I already knew I was going to bring a voice recorder with me to this meeting. If Sterling was going to corner me, then he certainly underestimated a man who had spent 15 years looking for vulnerabilities in complex systems. "By the way," he said, getting into the car, "don't forget to clean up those horrible weeds by your fence by tomorrow. It would be a shame to start our conversation by discussing a new fine." Coming back home, I sat for a long time on my lawn that was perfectly trimmed, facing the ocean. The sun was setting, painting the sky blood red. I did not know what the morrow would bring, but I knew one thing for certain: it was no longer just a battle for the site. It was a war against a system inbred and infested upon honest people for too long. He had been scheduled for 10 o'clock in the morning, but I had arrived a half hour early. The small voice recorder in the breast pocket seemed to weigh as heavy as lead. The secretary, the same young woman with the sad eyes, gave a sympathetic glance. "Mr. Sterling will be ready to receive you within 5 minutes," she said softly. While I was waiting, I noticed a pile of documents on her desk. The title of the top folder caught my eye: Oak Grove Ride Projectment. The secretary went out for coffee and, well, I used some speed reading skills and managed to run my eyes over the first page. What I saw sent a chill down my spine. Keen Grandiose, a 15-story hotel complex overlooking the ocean. Budget is $120 million. And to implement it was necessary to create more sites. Among them was mine. In the lower corner of the page was the signature of the mayor of the city. "Ah, Mr. Anderson." Sterling's voice brought me out of my cogitations. "I asked you to come to my office? I have an interesting offer for you." The next 45 minutes, I listened to his generous offer. $300,000 for my plot is almost $100,000 less than I paid. "That's more than you'll get after all the fines accumulate," he smiled. "Think of it as reasonable compromise." "What if I refuse?" I asked, feeling the recorder write every word. His smile broadened. "Then we will continue to apply the HOA rules." "All the rules? By the way, did you know that your fence is set to 0 as much as 7/10 of an inch deeper than allowed? This is a serious violation of the building code." As I was going home, I saw some suspicious activity outside of Sarah's house. There were 2 men in suits taking pictures of something in her yard. As I drove closer, they quickly got into a black SUV and drove off. "They're threatening to take custody of the children, saying I am putting them in danger," Sarah said the moment I walked in. She poured her coffee with hands that were shaking. "Some old accusations against my ex-husband, and now they maintain that I am putting kids in danger by failing to obey the rules of the HOA." I played for her the recording of my conversation with Sterling. "This can be proof." Her eyes widened. "But last year Jim Parker also had proof." The next day, his house was robbed and all records disappeared. And a week later he was fired from his job. That night, I sat at the computer for very long, backing up the recording to all sorts of cloud services. Suddenly, the screen flickered and went dead. The lights in the whole house went out. Looking out the window, I saw that the whole block was left without power. "Technical problems happen," the electrician said next morning while examining the shield. "But it's weird, only your line has been damaged." Even weirder is that it obviously had a cut in the cable from someone. When I came back from work, there was a notice on the door about a new fine, this time for $1,000 for creating a dangerous electrical situation. And someone painted a red cross on the front door. "That's their sign," said Mr. Chin, who lived next door and had been here for 20 years. "When a red cross shows up, soon the property of a person gets taken away. I've seen this 7 times so far." I couldn't sleep that night, sat in the darkness of my home, and frantically searched the internet for any information about similar cases in other cities. What I found was really breathtaking. Similar schemes were working all over the country, but nobody could stop them. Until my eyes fell upon the old court precedent of 1972. A matter that everybody appeared to have forgotten about. A case that could have changed everything. That night, I learned one simple truth: sometimes you have to lose everything to find a solution. The court precedent Harris vs. Oak Hill Community in 1972 shone on my screen like a beacon of hope. But before I could delve into the details of the case, my phone rang. "You'd better come," Sarah's voice was trembling. They came for me. I jumped out of the house without even closing the laptop. Outside, there were 3 police cars and Sterling's black Mercedes. 2 police officers were holding some papers while a social worker spoke with the twins, who looked afraid. "Violations of HOA rules create a dangerous environment for minors," I heard Sterling say. "You can't do that," I shouted, running up. Sterling turned to me with that icy smile of his. "Oh, Mr. Anderson, how convenient it is that you are here. I have news for you too. Your violations of HOA rules have reached a critical point." He handed me a stack of papers. 43 violations in the last 3 weeks. Total amount $125,000. You have 48 hours to pay, otherwise we will sue. The next 24 hours blurred by in a fog. I called all the lawyers of this town, and it was always the same thing, some variation on, "I'm sorry, but we are not taking cases against the Oak Grove HOA." After the 5th cup of whiskey, one told me the real thing: "Boy, they control everything from the city council to the local judges." I sat in my half-empty house, watching the ocean sunset. Probably for the last time. The phone burst with the calls of collectors. The bank threatened to take away the house due to a violation of the mortgage conditions. It seemed there was no way out. "Mr. Anderson?" A voice of a stranger on the door made me shiver. An elderly man in a shabby suit stood on the threshold. "My name is James Harris Jr., and I think you need my help." I couldn't believe it. Harris is the last name in the court precedent that I found. "You? Are you related to the case of 1972? The old man smiled. "It was my father's business. He won it using the old land law from the time of the gold rush. A law which everybody has forgotten about. A law that is still in force." The next 3 hours were spent studying old documents. It turned out that the land on which the entire Oak Grove area stands has some kind of special status. According to the law of 1849, any restrictions of use for this land are subject to approval by a special commission of the state. "Now look at your HOA's charter," Harris said, pulling out a magnifying glass. "See this seal? It is fake. And I can prove it." For the first time in many days, I felt a glimmer of hope. But Harris quickly cooled my enthusiasm. "It's going to be a tough battle. My father won, but the consequences were heavy. Are you willing to risk everything?" I looked out into the window. In my yard, I saw Sarah's children. They were sitting on a swing, probably for the last time before being taken away. Across the street, Mrs. Chin cried because she had received another notice of a fine. Already visible on the horizon were taps. Sterling didn't waste any time. "You know what?" I finally said, turning back to Harris. "I'm a programmer. I'm used to looking for vulnerabilities in systems and exploiting them. Maybe it's time to break the biggest corrupt system in our city." The old man smiled. "Then let's start. But remember, once we start, there will be no turning back. The first rule in war is to know the enemy," Harris said, laying aged documents out on my kitchen table. "The second rule is to know who your allies are really." It was 3 a.m. and we were strategizing. For 50 years of legal practice, I have learned one thing: the devil is in the details. He took out a yellow document. "Here is the original act of land allotment in the year 1849. And here is a copy in the city archive. Do you notice the difference?" I looked closer. The documents were identical in every respect, apparently. Yet one critical phrase was missing from the copy. "And no restrictions on the use of this land shall be imposed without the approval of the Special Commission of the State of California." "But how?" I asked. "How could they forge official documents?" Harris smiled bitterly. "Money, my friend. A lot of money. According to my calculations, Sterling's project will bring him about $300 million in net profit." The next day, I took time off from work and started digging deeper. My skills as a programmer have finally come in handy. I wrote a simple script to analyze all real estate transactions in Oak Grove over the past 10 years. "Look," I showed Harris the result. "Every time that somebody lost their property through the HOA, there was a whole set of complicated transactions 2 or 3 months afterwards. The money flowed through 15 different companies, but in the end, some of it ended up in offshore accounts associated with city council members." Suddenly, there was a knock at the door. Sarah stood at the threshold with her children. "They're evicting us tomorrow," she said in a shaky voice. "But before we go, I want to show you something." She pulled out an old photo album. "My father worked in the city council 30 years ago. And her voice shook, "he left it to me before he died. Said it might be needed someday." The album had photos of the beginnings of the construction of Oak Grove, and on one, the original boundary sign was up, full text of the restrictions clear. "We had it. It changes everything, Harris said, peering at the photos. But we need more. Much more. For the next 3 days, we worked without rest. I contacted other victims of the HOA through secure lines. The stories were terrible: threats, intimidation, fake accusations. But people were afraid to speak in public. I can help, said Sterling's secretary, meeting me outside a supermarket. She had seen them do it for years, had copies of all the documents, but now looked around edgily. I need security guarantees. We arranged a secret meeting at a motel outside the city. There were 12 former owners, one secretary with documents, Mrs. Chin, who had recorded all violations for 20 years, and even a former city council member who couldn't bear the burden of his guilt. They will come for us, someone said. They always come. Harris stood. That is why we must act quickly and decisively. We have evidence, we have witnesses, and we have the law on our side. All of a sudden, on my way home, the black SUV followed me, and a text beamed on my cell phone. It's not too late to stop. Think about your future. Mine was a one-word response. Think about yours. That night, we finished preparing the lawsuit. 300 pages of evidence, 52 witnesses, hundreds of photographs and documents. Tomorrow at 9 o'clock in the morning we will file it in federal court. And then the real war will begin.